So in this video, I want to show you how to calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the total surplus in the context of international trade. So I'm going to do an example for exports first. So let's again consider the markets for goldfish. And remember from before that a country would be exporting if and only if the world price is greater than the domestic price. Okay, so the first thing you should conclude from this graph is this higher price, $6, would be the world price for goldfish, and this lower price, $4, will be the domestic price for goldfish. So we're going to calculate the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus in the case when this country doesn't do trade. So in this case, we're going to go with the domestic price, which is $4. So recall from before that consumer surplus, graphically, it is the area that's below the demand function and above the equilibrium price. Okay, so since the country doesn't do trade, we're going to go with this domestic price, which is $4. So consumer surplus would be the area A and B. And producer surplus, this is the area that's below the equilibrium price and above the supply function. So that's C. Adding up those two components, the total surplus, which by definition is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, would be A, B, and C. So what would happen to these three quantities after this country exports goldfish? So first of all, the equilibrium price of goldfish would increase from $4 to $6 as this country doing exports. So given this new price, which is $6, consumer surplus, again, this is the area below the demand and above the price. Remember that now the price is actually $6. So that makes the consumer surplus to be just this area A, because the equilibrium price has changed from $4 to $6. And similarly, producer surplus, that's the area below the equilibrium price, which is now $6 and above the supply function. So that's B, C, and D. Adding up the consumer surplus and producer surplus, we conclude the total surplus after trade is A, B, C, and D. Okay, so did this country better off after it opens free trade? So to answer this question, we calculate the difference between the total surplus before and after the trade and try to figure out whether the total surplus increased or not. Now, if you compare these two quantities, in the case of before, total surplus is A, B, C, but after it opens free trade, the total surplus becomes A, B, C, and D. Okay, so it actually does increase. And the increment in total surplus, which is this component D, we would call that the gains from trade. And in addition, as this country opens free trade, producers gets better off because the price of goldfish increased, but consumers actually got worse off because they have to pay a higher price to purchase goldfish. In the case of before, everybody paid $4, but as it opens free trade, consumers have to pay $6. So consumers gets worse off. But the gains in producers is greater than the loss of producers. That is the reason why the total surplus would increase, because the positive influence is greater than the negative influence of international trade. So now let's move on to example of imports. So in this case, we're considering a country that's importing plasma TVs. So the domestic price of plasma TV is $3,000, and the world price of the plasma TV is $1,500. Okay, since world price is lower than the domestic price, so this country will be importing. Now let's calculate those surpluses. So in the case before, when this country doesn't do trade, so we're going to go with this domestic price, $3,000. So given this price, consumer surplus is everything that's above this price and below the demand, that's area A. And producer surplus, that's that's the area that's below this equilibrium price and above the supply function. So that's B and C. Therefore, the total surplus is A, B, and C, okay, which is similar than the first graph. Okay, so the total surplus is A, B, and C. And what would happen for the case after this country decided to do imports? So first of all, we note that the equilibrium price of plasma TV would decrease from 3,000 to 1,500. Given this new price, which is the world price of plasma TV, $1,500, consumer surplus is the area that's above this price and below the demand function. So that's A, B, and D. And producer surplus is everything that's below this price and above the supply function. Okay, so that's this area C. So it makes the total surplus to be A, B, C, and D. Again, in this importing case, we find the total surplus after the trade is greater than the total surplus before the trade. So again, in this case, this entire country actually better off from importing because the total surplus has gone up after this country decided to do imports. So keep in mind that in this case, consumer gets better off because everybody pay a lower price for plasma TV, but producers actually gets worse off because they receive a lower price of selling the plasma TV. So before they received 3,000, but afterwards they only receive 1,500. Okay. So some final remark. First of all, whether a country imports or export depending on the relationship between the world price and the domestic price. If the world price is higher than the domestic price, as we present in the first example, this country would be exporting. If alternatively the world price is lower than the domestic price, then the country will be importing. So in addition, we also conclude that free trade is good because the total surplus in both cases, whether the country is importing or exporting, is always greater than the total surplus in the case when the country is not doing free trade at all. And in both cases, we conclude the gains from trade is this area D. So this is for export and this is for import. So that's why we argue free trade is good because the total surplus in both cases has gone up. However, keep in mind that free trade, it creates winners and losers. So not everybody better off from free trade. In the case for export, consumers get worse off, whereas in the case of imports, producers get worse off. So not everybody better off from free trade.